Okay, we're back, we're live, we're here. Likable Science on a Monday sort of confuses you, but hey, we like science all the time. And matter of fact, tech is our middle name, and tech is the essence of science. Science, tech, all the same. We want to make Hawaii a tech and science state. We are working hard to do that.
There we go.
Okay, anyway, so now we got Ethan Allen, who is, in fact, the host of Likable Science, as it is regularly played on Friday, 1 to 2. And he is a scientist, which makes him able, that's the thing about scientists. You know, may I say this? You think a scientist is locked in a certain, silo. It isn't true. Most of the scientists we talk to can do anything. They have read it all, studied it all, they know. And so, Ethan can come up on stuff. It just amazes me. So I call him today. I say, Ethan, have you seen the article in the New York Times, about DNA phenotyping? He says, well, I'll look right now. And now he's here. He's going to tell us about it. We're going to call this, what's it?
Forensic
phenotyping. DNA phenotyping, okay, which is brand new. This was posted on the New York Times at 10:48 this morning. We're talking about something very recent. So, Ethan, speaking from science, what's going on here with DNA and phenotyping?
Well, Jay, this is actually sort of the reverse of what you commonly think of extracting information from DNA, although it's a very simple concept in theory. Our DNA basically determines who we are, and our DNA shapes every aspect of our physical and mental beings. It builds all the proteins that make us up, and it is the instructions for each one of us as an individual. So this idea of forensic DNA phenotyping simply says, well, we just have to recreate what our cells do by themselves and look at someone's DNA and say, who are they? What do they look like? What color are their eyes? What color is their hair? How tall are they? How much do they weigh? How old are they? Sort of seems simple in theory, very complicated, of course. There are, in our DNA, 23,000 roughly genes that we have, plus innumerable control elements for those genes, turning those genes on, off, making them express a little stronger, a little weaker. So it's a very tricky business. Certain characteristics are relatively easy to spot from DNA. A lot of eye color is determined by a relatively tiny number of genes, and if they can spot those genes, they can say, this person had blue eyes, or this person had brown eyes. The idea here is that we are constantly all shedding DNA. We constantly shed cells wherever we go. We are leaving traces of ourselves behind. So if you are committing a crime somewhere, and you wipe your hand across a table surface, you leave cells of your body there, and those cells all have DNA in them. And each strand of that DNA, which by the by, it's about 2 to 3 meters long, a strand of DNA in each cell, yes, has all the instructions for every bit of your body, basically.
48,000?
Well, 23,000 genes.
23,000 genes,
but
and each one is double or something like that.
Well, lots of control elements on either end of them, yes.
Yeah.
So the question is, of course, it's a sort of classic, almost the classic internet issue. It's information overload. How do we read all that information in a meaningful way? And that's what they're now developing software tools to do, to look at that DNA and sort of read it backwards and be able to say, given this stretch of DNA, this individual is of certain ethnic ancestry, has a certain eye color, may have certain hair color, may be prone to certain genetic diseases. So it's a very useful tool. You can see right away why the police would love it.
Yeah.
Raises all kinds of interesting questions, though.
Yes. Well, I mean, this is phenomenal, actually. I remember reading a book and reporting on a book, and actually we had the author on the show by telephone from the East Coast. The book was called The Chosen, and it was about DNA. It was about having your DNA tested. This is probably around 10 years ago. And he found lots of anecdotes, but he found a priest in a Catholic church in New Mexico who had his DNA tested, and it told him that he was like 99.9% Jewish. And the priest, completely bought into that. I mean, it's science. You can't really argue with that's what they told him. And you know, they have these global maps of where you came from, and the priest came from somewhere in Spain, which is likely, you know, because remember there was the Inquisition back in 1492. Anyway, so the priest told his people in his congregation about this, and he said he was going to change the liturgy in the services in this Catholic church to incorporate some Jewish, you know, prayers and hymns and what have you. And he did, and they liked him so much as a priest, they went along with it.
Excellent.
So it became a kind of, you know,
A chimera,
right.
a hybrid, right?
It was a hybrid. And the Pope, I think, excommunicated everybody, but it worked pretty well for this congregation.
Well, it's interesting you mention that, because it's more and more scientists are finding that people are chimeras. There was a recent case came up of this woman in her mid-40s having her third child, pregnant with her third child, and for various reasons, her doctors began doing a little bit more elaborate tests on her, and what they found out was that basically about half the cells in her, half of her tissues, were male tissues, and only half were female. She was a mix of two different embryos, basically, one of which had probably consumed the other, basically, in utero. And this is actually not terribly uncommon that we have these kinds of things happening, but being pregnant with her third child, to discover that she was literally half male was, of course, somewhat unnerving, as it was probably for this Catholic priest.
Yes, yes, yes.
So this is the kind of stuff that our DNA testing is now revealing. And this article in the New York Times was looking at just, as I say, sort of the reverse process of that.
Well, you know, aren't we lucky to be alive in a time where they're finally figuring out the human genome, and when we can see so much in DNA, not only as an informational matter, but as an identification matter, and maybe even a manipulation matter, who knows?
Sure.
And this is moving so fast. I don't think the public really knows, and good for the Times to make this an online headline that way. But let's get to the story, though. First of all, phenotyping. What in the world is that? Is it like phenobarbital? What is that?
No, the latter is a chemical compound. The former is a process. Phenotyping is sort of making something real. We all have a genotype, that is a set of genes that you could talk about, but we also have a phenotype. My phenotype says I'm roughly 5'11", I have hazel eyes, I have brown hair, et cetera, et cetera. I have probably certain predispositions to certain diseases and certain resistance to other diseases. I have, you know, earlobes that are attached or unattached. You know, there's a million qualities to your phenotype. But all phenotyping is talking about is making something into a physical reality.
Okay, so the relationship of the information in the genetic in the DNA to what you are.
Right.
But let me ask. I mean, I know it's fresh, but so if I'm just born, and you get my DNA, is it going to tell that I'm going to be 5'11"? Is it going to tell all these physical characteristics that I will have when I'm an adult, or is it too early to ask the DNA?
No, your DNA will tell you a great deal, at least about your potential. It will say you have the potential to grow to 5'11" or 6'3" or whatever. You may not realize that. If you are starved as an infant, you probably won't realize it. Again, there's very interesting issues now coming up with so-called epigenetic phenomena.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Which are traits passed along from parents to offspring that are not truly in the genes anymore, but have to do with gene regulation.
Which means that in the life of the parent, the DNA changed.
Well, the regulation,
some environmental factor changed the DNA, so it's not a perfect pass-through.
Right, in a sense, that is, if let us just say your mother was experienced prolonged and frequent periods of hunger and starvation, that will have her genome in response will have upregulated certain genes, will have changed the activity of certain kinds of genes to try to basically cope with this stress. Those changes will then be reflected in you as her child, basically, in some sense.
It's so remarkable.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing.
And it's only come to light in the last few years.
Right. It's not classic Mendelian genetics at all. It's called epigenetics. It's above, beyond the genes.
And when you, I mean, I don't want to get too far off on the subject, but when you see that, say in the hunger and the obesity issue, I guess is part of it, when you see that, you think, well, I wonder how many other traits have been modified in my mother and in me.
Right.
So the old notion of passing on this inviolate information to your children and knowing what their propensities were, that's really moderated now.
Yes, exactly.
You could be developing new traits to pass on to them or not every day.
Absolutely.
And it's weird because it's iconoclastic for what we learned in school.
Exactly, yes. And again, the whole thing of the chimerism that I was just talking about too, so you may be a conglomeration of 2 or more individuals, 3 individuals quite possibly. You may have tissues that are really all your father's and none of your mother's, and vice versa, or other tissues that could have been part of a sibling's. So yes, it's not as straightforward as the sort of simplistic storybook Punnett squares would tell us.
More digression, but it's worth it, I think. So if I know that my genes can be modified on the fly, or my mother's, to pass on to me or not, then maybe I can find a way to go and do that affirmatively. I can take some genetic material, I can modify it, and then I can put it in an embryo, and I can start a whole new line on that characteristic. Am I right?
I mean, in theory, if we understood this business, you should be able to increase the expression of desired genes, basically.
GMOs?
And pass that along, well, without even really going into genetically modifying people. You should be able, in the same sense of this epigenetic modification that occurs all the time from stresses of various sorts, you should be able to do that in a positive way if you wanted, yes.
Okay, but now you take it a little further and say, I'm willing to do GMO. I want my kid to be 6 feet tall.
Lots of people do, right?
Yeah, a lot of people do, I can do that. I mean, I can't do this right now today, but it's out there and it's only an inch away, isn't it?
Right. There are various groups now, one probably the best known is called 23andMe, who will do elaborate analyses of your DNA and tell you all kinds of things about yourself, including your sort of ethnographic heritage, your propensity to develop certain diseases, yes, whether you achieved your full height or not, or, various kinds of things like this. It's still a very young science, and there's lots of...
Moving fast.
Yeah, moving fast, lots of unknowns about it, lots of claims made that turn out later not to be quite verifiable. So there's also a lot of hype in it, too.
Now, how about propensity toward diseases and, unfavorable conditions of one, medical conditions of one kind or another?
Sure.
If I find that I have a gene that allows, that makes me likely to catch something bad, then theoretically, this is the same thing, making my kids 6 feet tall, I can turn that gene off and I can make my kid not, invulnerable to that problem.
Right. So, I mean, a classic example would be there are people who are genetically prone to die of heart disease in an early age. They have horrendously high cholesterol levels just because of their genetic makeup. In theory, you could take an embryo, find that this embryo, particularly just a fertilized egg, had that condition. You could send in a viral vector to knock out that gene and replace it with a good, healthy cholesterol set of genes that would give you nice high HDL, low LDL, a nice balance, and poof, there's your embryo grows up to be a perfectly healthy one.
Catch it in the embryo,
you do it once,
make the change, and now the whole line, my whole genetic line is improved, doesn't have that problem anymore.
Right. Yeah.
But furthermore, I could back that up. I could go to my mother now, and I could somehow do that, what did you call it, where you change the epigenetic?
Right.
Epigenetic.
Right.
I can make an epigenetic change in her so that I can improve her health. I know this, they haven't done this yet, okay, but it doesn't sound that far away. If I could make a DNA change in a given person about, say, vulnerability to a disease, I could change the way that body, that physical body reacts to that disease, the vulnerability of that body in the lifetime of that individual. You heard it here on
Yeah,
ThinkTech.
well, it's very tricky there. You're getting into a very tricky issue here. But yes, in some sense, in theory, you could do that.
We got a long way to go on that one.
Right. You could go and infect them with a vector and begin altering their DNA, basically. And yes.
Wow. It's great to be alive, but when you have this, it'll make you alive a long time,
right.
much longer. Okay, we're back. We're not back. We're going to leave now. Talking about the DNA really confuses me. This Ethan Allen next to me, he's a scientist. He's the host of Likable Science, and I'm standing in for him as host of Likable Science. And we're talking about
forensic DNA
phenotyping today, which off an article that appeared in the morning electronic version of the New York Times. We are very current. We'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Okay, we're back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidell with Ethan Allen, who's a scientist and the host of Likable Science. And we're doing Likable Science today about forensic DNA phenotyping, which is an article that appeared in today's electronic version of the New York Times. So in that article, Ethan, there was a case study of some kind?
Right.
What were they talking about?
So this involved a case in South Carolina, I believe, in Columbia, South Carolina, of a mother and her small child, 3-year-old child, had been murdered, and there were essentially virtually no clues. There was no one had seen anything, no security cameras had caught any images, there was no real evidence of forced entry, but there was a little bit of foreign DNA left somewhere in the crime scene. And the police, after exhausting all other leads, eventually went to a commercial firm and asked them to forensically phenotype that DNA. So tell them who that person was. And this firm came up with a sort of a generic description, actually built a face that they said this person would look like. And it's based on a very elaborate, what do you call it, algorithm that they have that looks at a lot of different spots in the DNA which are known to control facial structure and tries to put these things together in a sensible way and rebuild a face. And this particular case did not, the face led to a couple more leads. Nothing panned out, as I understand from the article. But it opens up very interesting ideas.
So what happened to the case?
As far as I know, it's still open. They're still looking for this person.
But they have
some idea
of characteristics
right now
that they could help them identify.
Right. There are questions here because of the way that the model, the algorithm was developed. That is, it was developed largely from people of European ancestry, and therefore it probably is not as good at detecting characteristics of people who were not of European ancestry. So if you are of either Asian or African American or African ancestry, probably this model is not going to work very well. And there were some questions raised in this case because indeed they identified this person of interest as being dark-skinned, and so they don't really know exactly how reliable this whole thing was. And apparently they've done some studies of this where they've taken known individuals' DNA and had the software rebuild them. And some faces look very remarkably good, and some are just sort of generic faces that could be almost anyone. So, as I say, it's a young science.
It's a young science, but it's going to go somewhere because it's very provocative. It's
very powerful.
It's powerful.
Right.
I mean, it could solve all kinds of issues. But you said that it raised all kinds of issues.
Right.
What kinds of issues does it raise, you think?
Well, it means that basically anywhere you go or have been, you can be detected. And they can, from that DNA, sort of tell that you were there. There's a lot of fear that this will lead to sort of profiling, because if the DNA says this is typical DNA from from a Hispanic population, for instance, then the police will be on the lookout for a Hispanic. If it says it's a DNA from a Caucasian female, then they're going to be looking for Caucasian females. So it can sort of bias an investigation in that sense. If it's done correctly and is truly a valid method, then that's, to some extent, that's all well and good. It's narrowing the field of suspects. If indeed the model is not perfect, which it really is not, then you can see you get into some very iffy ethical issues here.
Yeah, well, I think there's two logical tracks on this. One is where you put your hand down on the table, and I get a clear and totally reliable sample of your DNA. I know it's yours. Okay, that may not be so easy.
Right.
Let's assume it started out clean.
Right.
Now there's DNA there. I take the DNA, and with some study and programming and algorithms, I can find out your height, your color, your I don't know, blood type, and on and on and on for virtually thousands of characteristics.
Right.
And I'll be able to, not only will I be able to identify you by comparing your DNA with what I found on the table, but I'll be able to draw a picture of you.
Right.
I'll be able to get your facial bones, and I replaced the police sketch artist.
Exactly.
Completely.
Exactly, yes.
The Union of Police Sketch Artists probably posted. So I will be able to find you in a crowd, really.
Right. In theory, this will do that.
And in theory, if you add to that in major cities today, there are cameras everywhere that can identify faces and compare faces against sketches.
Right.
Then conceivably you could find this individual in a crowd in a city through the cameras.
Right.
Yeah.
Which indeed could be a perfectly very good thing if indeed this was legitimately a criminal who you had a vested interest in finding. But again, it could identify somebody who had been at that same spot at a different time and had nothing to do with the case, and
Right.
just.
And you get into probabilities.
Right.
It's the same way medical demographics work, like oncology. You have lots of variables, and medical science doesn't know exactly how they interplay. And the same thing here. So if I say that I have a match, so to speak, of characteristics and your facial, you and your photograph, or you and your face as the DNA reports your face, I can't be totally sure. What's my level of confidence, right? Is it 80% or 90% or what? Of course, then when I compare your actual DNA with what I found on the table,
Right.
that's a higher level of confidence.
Right.
So it's a matter of finding you, okay, so that I can make that comparison
Right.
of your actual DNA and the DNA on the
Right.
table.
And then that actually opens whole new legal issues. If
Like
you
search and seizure
right.
is what it is.
Am I compelled to give you a DNA sample? Is that or is that essentially something you have a right to
Well, I can
demand from
trick
me?
you. I can just make you
Right.
put your hand on the table.
They've routinely done that, of course, with fingerprinting and all.
Yeah.
Hand somebody a nice clean can of Coke and then take that and lift their fingerprints off of it.
But there's now another
Right.
way to do this
Right.
too, and that is an iterative process. And I think there's really a legitimate argument about the iterative process. So in profiling, we talked about. So I get the DNA off the table,
Right.
and I find out that this person is a Caucasian male, 46 years old, who's 5'9", and I don't know what, whatever, blue eyes,
Right.
okay, whatever. Okay, now I go looking for that person.
Right.
Okay, I'm still not totally sure that the DNA on the table is the DNA of the culprit.
Right.
So I have to do this kind of iterative thing. So then I find this person who matches this sample,
Right.
and then I look for an alibi, where were you on such and such a day?
Right.
And whether there were circumstances in your life that gave motive to the crime.
Right.
And all that stuff.
And ideally try to get a DNA sample from them. So
and ideally get the DNA.
Compare it. And
it's the same issue, isn't it?
If it's a perfect match, then you know it probably was the same individual.
Right.
Yes.
So it is profiling, but it's profiling on a very sophisticated level.
Exactly, exactly. But again, depending upon how good that model is, people will argue that it may be a very hit or miss kind of profiling, you know.
Yeah. Well, but if I made it very good, if I went and studied and I wrote really good algorithms,
right.
and I found, you know, in a laboratory sample that it was 99.9
right. And
accurate.
Things, for instance, blue or brown eye color, apparently they can do forensically phenotype that quite accurately. Other eye colors, not nearly as much, apparently. Hair color, a little less so, because there's aging issues with hair color, of course. Height, much less so. Height is a lot more variable, a lot more dependent upon what happened to you early in life, and that's not going to show up in your DNA so much. You know, so yeah, there are all kinds of interesting issues. And furthermore, of course, as one of my guests on Likable Science some months ago pointed out, we all have living on us a rich zoo of microbes, right? And these microbes get left on the table too. And my microbes are different than your microbes and are very distinctive to me. So even if you don't have my DNA, you may have my microbes' DNA, and you can tell that it was me from.
So you identify by the microbes.
Right. Right.
And the microbes themselves have DNA.
Right.
So I can
from their
separate every microbe from every other microbe.
Right.
So I get a very high rate of confidence on identifying a microbe.
Right. Yes.
So I don't even need your DNA anymore.
Right. No,
all I have to do is associate the microbe with
right.
your DNA.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing does have very interesting directions for sure.
Well, let's talk about the directions. You know, I mean, it's fascinating because the reason it's fascinating to me is that the law, that's got to play a big role in this whole discussion. The law isn't anywhere near where we're talking about.
Right.
The law would have, you know, you could beat this kind of identification in a trial anytime. It's just not there, but it will be there.
Right. I'm sure the law is scrambling to catch up with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. And the science will move ahead even faster than we can imagine.
Right.
It'll be even more impressive than we can imagine right now.
Right. At some point, you can envision that there will be let's just say an identification system for locks where you lay a finger on a lock. It samples your microbe's DNA and your own DNA, compares these against a database, you know, looks at your face, says, is this the same individual that I believe it is? You know, if any of these things don't match, basically it keeps you locked out. You know, it will be very sophisticated, very
way beyond fingerprints, way beyond
right,
that.
Yeah, be very hard to beat in some sense. But
I'll tell you a short story about a guy who's at the medical school right now. His name is Greenwood, Dr. Gig Greenwood. Amazing man, he's an MD researcher. And he became a doctor so he could do medical research, not so he could practice medicine, okay? And we had him on the show a couple of times. First time we had him on the show, he told us about this incredible thing he was doing, was he was selling human serum and blood to big pharma companies who were doing pharmaceutical research on the mainland. So he would, you know, get the serum and the blood samples, right? Diversity samples, all diversity in Hawaii. And he would send them in dry ice, you know, back to the big pharma companies to do their research. And, you know, you get paid for that. Good. Next time I saw him, I said, well, how's your shipments going? He said, I don't have any shipments anymore. What happened to the shipments? Well, I analyzed the blood and the serum, you know, for the chemical makeup and the DNA and all these characteristics, tens of thousands of characteristics. And I sent him a database by email. I don't need to send him anything in Federal Express. You know? And that's where we're going on this.
Well, yeah, it's like my old boss, Leroy Hood, Dr. Leroy Hood of Institute for Systems Biology, says that biology is fundamentally an information science now. And that's exactly, there are huge, if you want to say it that way, databases. And that's, our DNA is each of us has this big database within them of DNA. And in essence, that has all the instructions about everything, about how to build us, about how to build each and every tissue in our body, about how to put us together. And you know, there is information coded in there, and there's information coded then into how you build proteins. Those proteins themselves have sort of more information within them. So
well, I think it's a violation of some sort that you should know the DNA of my bacteria. But let's take a break. Ethan Allen, scientist and host of Likable Science, here on we're calling this Likable Science on Monday, and we're talking about forensic DNA phenotyping as it appeared in the New York Times this morning online edition. We'll be right back, and we'll talk some more about how he's violating my bacteria.
Hi, aloha. My name is Chris Leatham, and I host a show called The Economy and You. The show plays every Wednesday at noon, and on my show, I bring on guests who are interested or working in the technology space. And so I'd like you to come and watch the show and learn with me about all the sort of exciting things that we're doing in Hawaii to build and grow our economy ecosystem. So I'd like to say aloha, and I look forward to seeing you on the show. Thank you.
We're live. We're live. We're here with Ethan Allen, Likable Science, a scientist, and the host of Likable Science, except we're doing Likable Science on Monday, and I'm the host instead. Gives me a sense of empowerment. Anyway, so Ethan, the thing about knowing your DNA, knowing, everything about your DNA, like there's very little left not to know. And then to go further and find the bacteria that live with your DNA and knowing their DNA, I mean, it's like a whole new level and a whole new extension of information.
Yes.
I mean, and taken together, it makes identification 100% reliable, I mean, theoretically, because every little DNA strand about that big in every little bug and in the DNA that, you left with the bug. This changes things, and your point during the break really throws me. I mean, it was what I was trying to articulate is we see ourselves as human beings, as individuals, especially in the West. They say, right?
Right.
The West, people are more individualistic. Right. We see ourselves as individuals, not as a bunch of numbers. Right. This makes us a bunch of numbers.
Right.
How do we deal with that?
Right.
Sounds like they're taking away something. They're denuding us of our humanity.
No, quite the contrary, though, Jay. If we all are conglomerations, each of us has about 10 times as many cells in us and on us that are not our own cells as we do our own cells. 10 times as many. You are only about 10% of your cells, what you think of as you, are your own cells. Now, the rest of them are much smaller cells, which is why we sort of look the way we do, because our cells make up the vast bulk of us. But then all these little microbes, very specific microbes that live in very specific places and are unique to each of us. Each of us has a completely sort of our own specialized zoo, you could think of it, that we live on, our own ecosystem, if you prefer.
It doesn't give me comfort, I'm sorry, but go ahead.
And that's why then again, as my guest on an earlier show had been saying, that basically you can tell from that population of microbes who the person who left them was, because no one else is going to leave that same conglomeration, that same mix of microbes. There are many different species, and they occur in different ratios, in different people, and so it's a very elaborate kind of thing, and it is. Some people it's very unsettling to realize how sort of multifaceted we are, instead of just being one.
It's on a long continuum, over it must be a couple of hundred years anyway. Walden Pond, Thoreau, getting away from the masses, getting away from the cities where you're under a microscope, going to the Northwest Territories and living in the woods with polar bears and the like. I mean, all that seems to be over now. There's very few human beings that can escape, civilization, technology, science, and the complete identification of everything you are in a database. Ooh.
Well, the world's a very big place still, Jay, and there are lots of people who live pretty far outside the range.
I don't know any of them myself.
That's one, because they're living outside. Yes, what you know is people around here in Honolulu, in Hawaii, perhaps more in the US, some in Europe, some maybe in Asia, but less so in the more remote parts. You probably know relatively few people from Mongolia, for instance, and fewer still from northern Siberia, and probably fewer still from Ascension Island in the middle of the South Atlantic, right? But all these people are there, and some of them are hooked in, and some are not hooked in.
But they will be hooked in.
Sooner or later, yes. We're all getting that way. Yes, the trend is clear.
Yeah, I mean, for example, they know that my DNA comes from a certain place in Europe, and they can give me a map, right? All that.
In theory,
so if they don't know about the person in Birobidzhan, Siberia, they will.
Right.
They'll be able to map that person too. There'll be nobody to escape. I don't know why, but it makes me feel a little queasy. And then take one more. Do you remember Gregory Peck and the boys from Brazil?
Vaguely.
This
yes.
was a movie about how Hitler's DNA had been somehow retrieved, and they made 50 or 60 Hitlers, and these kids were all clones of Hitler, and they were seeded through Brazil of all places.
Sure.
And in order to return and do a Hitler thing again.
Right.
That was the movie. It was interesting.
Right.
But don't you see it possible if I take my call it my Greenwood database with my thousands and thousands of characteristics and switches on and off and all those things that you can measure, and I recreate somebody who is reflected in that database. I mean, this is like making life. This is like young Frankenstein. But why can't that happen?
Well, yes. I mean, you, in theory, in this day and age, literally, somebody probably could, and somebody probably will clone a human being within the next few years, I suspect, if it hasn't already been done. The issue is that we are far more than our genes, right? We are the sum of many, many, many experiences, and your clone, particularly a clone taken from you as an adult, is going to live a vastly different life than you did. They're going to grow up in very different circumstances. They're going to experience different enrichments, different stressors that are going to amplify or tamp down certain DNA expression.
Epigenetics, too.
Exactly. Yeah, so they're going to grow up, while they might resemble you at the same age pretty closely, even virtually identically will give, they're going to be a different person. They're going to have had, just very different thoughts, very different perceptions, very different schooling. Everything about their life is going to be different except for their genetic makeup. So I wouldn't be terribly worried about that, other than the weird sort of the weird legal issues it may bring up.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me there's probably an argument to be made for forget about this science. It's inhuman. We need philosophical warmth and to understand, appreciate the human condition. This science gets in the way.
No, Jay, the genie's out of the bottle. Pandora's box has been opened. You can't stuff it back in at this point. These technologies are out there. They're known. They're being used. To some extent, it is like the GMO debate. To some extent, this is, in a way, it's sort of a nonsense debate because the technology is out there. GMO, genetically modified organisms are around. There's going to be more of them in the future. Whether we legalize it, make it illegal, whatever, it's only going to have a transient effect on it. Yeah. You can't stop this kind of technology. You can't stop this. What we need to be giving careful consideration to, and we should engage our philosophers in this, is how do we use this science? How do we apply this science? How do we regulate this science? These are very tricky issues. And because there are great unknowns out there, there are cost-benefit ratios for every scientific technological advance. And we've talked about this in some earlier conversations, right? Some technological advance comes along and maybe it benefits you and it costs me. So
you have to make judgments about that.
Right. And if it benefits 1,000 people and hurts one, is that okay to use it? How badly does it hurt that person? What does it deprive them of?
These are the best of times.
Right. So, I hope. So yeah, I mean, that's much more where we need to have I think our good minds and our great philosophers is looking at how do we best use our science for humanity's betterment.
But even if my thought that we should abandon this thread of science in favor of sort of a philosophical humanity, even then, I am sure to a moral certainty that it will appear on CIS on television. In fact, I will make you a wager that sometime in the next month or two, we will see this New York Times article and the whole scenario you described being covered in detail on one of those NCIS programs.
Very, very likely. I will not bet against you on that one, Jay. No, this is a very hot topic, and there's a lot of very interesting potential in it. There's a lot of hype, but hey, today's science fiction is tomorrow's science.
We'll have to follow it.
Indeed.
Really enjoy this, Ethan.
Okay.
Likable Science, Ethan. It's wonderful.
Good talking with you today.
That's Ethan Allen, a scientist and the host of Likable Science. Here on a Monday Likable Science, we're talking about forensic DNA phenotyping, and that's really interesting, very provocative. We'll come back and do it some more. Aloha.
Aloha.